Well, welcome to another episode of 20 Schemes Uncut. I'm Pete, I'm the director of the hub in the west of Scotland for 20 Schemes. They've actually let me do another podcast, right? But they've said I can only do it if it's with another elder of Greenview Church in Glasgow, right? So we've got Andy Hunter, he fits that bill, and then I'm going for Colin and John next, okay? So we'll just let you know that. But Andy, good to have you with us.
Thank you, good to be here.
You want to share us a little bit about who you are, kind of brief history of ministry and what you're doing just now?
Sure. Okay, well, I live in Glasgow, south side, go to Greenview Church, the elder there. Married to Jessica, got 3 children, one's working, one's at uni, one's at school. And I work full-time with FIEC, Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, and my job is to try and support and work with churches in Scotland and the north of England.
And before that, you were, what was it called, a church worker?
Yeah, before that, I was a church worker, pastor, teacher at Greenview. So I worked there, local church ministry, for 9 years, and then I had a spell in Bible college, and then I was working for Strathclyde Passenger Transport for a number of years before that. So that was my kind of day job before ministry.
Excellent. And my favourite story about Andy Hunter is when he appeared legless on the stage at the FIEC conference. I'm sorry, what I mean by that is you fell on the way up the stage, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, a lack of a handrail on the way to the pulpit. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
No worries. I mean, you always bring the banter, Andy. It's one of the things I love most about you.
My finest hour, really. I'm glad that has served people well in the years since.
Good. Right, Andy, you, as part of your role then, I guess your job is to go about Scotland and trying to network, care for pastors in the FIEC and try and bring others that maybe are a similar statement of faith who would agree with what we FIEC believe and bring them in, which means I think you'll have a good kind of handle in some ways of the kind of church in Scotland and the kind of state of that. So I want to talk a little bit broadly just about your kind of take on that, what you see as maybe the trends in the Church of Scotland just now, and then maybe think a little bit about kind of what we're trying to do as 20 Schemes and if you would match up with that or if you agree with kind of our take on that. So in terms of Scotland as a whole, like we've got a lot of listeners from America, a lot of people remember us of the kind of land of the book. Scotland's got this great gospel history. We would say often it's not really like that now. Is that the case? Like, how would you describe the change since of our kind of history as a nation?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good starting point because I think there is a bit of romanticism about Scotland in the past. There's always romanticism about the past, you know, whatever you're thinking about, but it's not entirely kind of disconnected from reality in that Scotland has been quite remarkable in its kind of Christian history. I think if you think of its kind of Reformation history, its mission impact on the world, the godly men and women that have come out of Scotland, the impact it's had in many kind of areas of kind of theology and example, it has been quite remarkable. I mean, Scotland has definitely punched above its weight for a fairly small, sparsely populated country stuck out in the bleak North Atlantic. And if you actually go back even over the last century and you see just how much the church has declined, I think you have to see that kind of backdrop to see where we are today. So even in 1950, a quarter of the Scottish population would have had membership of the Church of Scotland.
And were you alive at that point then, 1950?
Not
you were
quite.
A pastor in the church? No?
That's right. I was doing the census. So you go back, I mean, even in my lifetime, so if you talk about when I was growing up, you might just have missed this, but like in my lifetime, on Scottish television, ministers were given a nightly slot to kind of speak to the nation.
Really?
A little slot called Late Call. It used to come on after the news in the evening, and a minister would sit there and, you know, give some kind of address or some thoughts on the Bible or something like that. It wasn't always terribly kind of punchy in terms of its gospel content, but that was a kind of measure of the kind of place that the church had and the influence the church had in Scottish society. So we've had a great Christian heritage. 1851, 60% of the Scottish population were in church on Church Census Sunday.
And do you think that would have been quite strongly evangelical, the kind of teaching then, the positions of the churches?
Yeah, largely. I mean, not entirely. And then, of course, what you get in the 19th century is a kind of shift towards a much more liberal church, which I think has huge consequences then for what happens in the 20th century. But really up until the mid of the 20th century, you still have a very large degree of Christian identification, of church association and affiliation in Scotland. But then really from the kind of 50s, you see these really kind of calamitous kind of falls. And I suspect that the kind of foundations, in a sense, the kind of faith beliefs of Scottish society had been hollowed out for quite a long time before that. And a bit like a big sinkhole that, you know, suddenly appears, actually the kind of underneath's been getting washed away for quite a long time. And you start to see really the reality of that from the sort of mid-20th century onwards. So as you take the Church of Scotland, which really historically I would say was a kind of shining jewel in the crown of Christ in many ways historically, in terms of its impact and some of the godly men and women that came out of the Church of Scotland and its heart for mission and other things like that. The Church of Scotland has declined by 80% since 1950, which is a kind of 4% decline a year, which equates even today to about 100 people leaving it a week. Or not being there a week, and that's partly aging kind of demographics, but it really is kind of calamitous. It's these real cliff edge falls that you've seen.
But it's also at the same time, over that period, the Church of Scotland has deliberately taken a more liberal, progressive stance on a lot of theological issues. Like from when I was working in the Church of Scotland, I remember from the 70s, there was kind of downgrade of what considered the Bible and a lot of that kind of thing. Like, do you think that's coincidental? Do you think there's that's a fair kind of assessment that the further we get away from the truth of the word, the more we're going to expect the church to erode? I think that's just our kind of hobby horse.
No, I think that is very much at the heart of the declines. And these things are complicated. There's lots of other kind of social trends and things going on in society. So you can't just reduce it to one thing. But sometimes the kind of reasons that were classically put forward for church decline don't always kind of stand up under analysis. So when I was at Bible college in the kind of noughties, I had to do an essay on why did the British stop going to church in the 20th century? And you look at the kind of classic things that are put forward. So people say, well, it was the rise of education and science. So as people became more educated and they understood the world better and science offered them all these solutions to their problems, then of course they're going to leave the mumbo jumbo and the fairy stories of religion behind. But if that was the case, you'd expect the biggest and most calamitous falls to have been among the more educated parts of society. And actually, often it was the reverse was true. So even today, and we'll come on to this, I'm sure, in discussion, the parts of the evangelical church that have stood up the best are often the more kind of middle class, kind of professional, university educated churches. So there's no kind of correlation or direct correlation between being more educated and not believing in Christianity or thinking the Bible can't be true. And also with kind of prosperity, people say, well, we just got better off, we became more comfortable, living standards rose, and therefore people didn't need the comfort blanket of God and religion anymore, could stand on their own feet and all the rest of it. But again, if you look at the States, where living standards historically have been higher than in Britain, especially in the 20th century, significantly higher, the evangelical church stood up and held up much more robustly, despite having much higher levels of prosperity than they did in Britain. So again, you can't say, well, just because people became better off and had more money, then of course they kind of gave up in faith. So I do think, not that those things didn't have any effect, you know, I'm sure there's impacts there, but I do think the kind of key thing is that in the late 1800s, you have the emergence of a much more liberal church and liberal theology across many of the larger denominations in Scotland and across the West, which guts the kind of gospel of its spiritual power, really, because the heart of the gospel is often undermined, confidence in the Bible is taken away. And even from a human level, it just robs the imperative for faith and for the church. If we're all just going to end up in heaven, if there's no urgency about that, then what's the point of the church? And if it's just about being a bit nicer, well, there's plenty of non-religious people who will sign up to that. So in lots of ways, I think that kind of emergence of liberal theology was calamitous, and you can trace many of the origins of church decline back to that. And I do think, it's probably a bit of a strong statement, but I do think personally that throughout the 20th century, what you saw was a liberal church squandering its evangelical inheritance, because it wasn't liberal theology that got the church in Scotland to the point where 60% of the population were in church. Now again, there's other factors there, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be simplistic about it, but that would be the number one factor, I think, if you're looking for a reason for just a falling away of confidence and a robust faith and an imperative for the gospel in Scotland.
Which definitely, just again, makes sense, because our confidence that Christ builds his church through his word, and if we're going to start eroding that, then it makes sense that the church is not going to have a solid foundation and it's going to fall, right? Like that, so the picture today, I remember the Barna research, must be maybe 10 years ago now, and it said at the time, was it 50% round about that are still identified in Scotland as Christian in some sense, but in many ways, it was a kind of cultural label, because when you got down to the heart, so it's that Bebeden quadrant of like what it truly kind of necessary of conversion, authority, scripture, all that. And there's what 2.5%, I think, at that stage that actually would be what we would consider biblical Christianity. So I think again, it can be easy for people, maybe even people in Scotland today would think, well, no, Scotland's still got a lot of Christians, it's a Christian nation in many ways, but actually if you're at the heart of that historic orthodox, what it is to believe the Bible, be a Christian, even 10 years ago, it was 2.5%, which is really low. And I think, one of the American NAMB or IMB or whatever, the mission boards would class unreached people group as like under 3%. Which again, I just thought was always really stark, because you would never think of Scotland as that unreached people group in that sense. But if we're talking about those figures right at the heart of biblical Christianity, it seems to be. I think that's true. I think there's very few these days that would be truly evangelical, would truly kind of be historically orthodox in terms of what it is to be a Christian.
I think that's undoubtedly the case. I think we're a tiny minority in terms of being Bible-believing evangelical Christians that would believe those kind of key tenets of the faith about the deity of Christ, the inerrancy of the Word of God, penal substitution, those kind of core heart doctrines of the faith, of the gospel. And I think the research you mentioned kind of bears that out. So 2022 this year is a census year in Scotland. So we've not had one for 11 years, because it should have been last year, but it's been rolled over because of COVID. So we're waiting to see what the census will say about religious belief and affiliation. But in 2011, it was 54% of the Scottish population identified as Christian in the most kind of superficial, nominal way you can imagine. You know, they looked at the list and they thought, well, I'm not a Muslim, you know, I'll tick the Christian box. But that 54% had dropped from about 65 or 67% from the previous census in 2001. So it's hard to imagine that this Scottish census, which has been carried out now, won't be the first Scottish census in history where a majority of the Scottish population don't identify as being Christian, in even the most superficial sense. I was almost certainly, I would be astonished if the number of people who identify as Christian doesn't fall below 50% at this time. But within that kind of 50% of kind of nominal identification, of course, when you start to break down what people actually believe and church attendance, of course, that figure kind of falls away massively. So that research you mentioned, the Transforming Scotland kind of research that was done by the McClellan Foundation, again, bears that out. I think they got down to a kind of figure of round about kind of 5% or 7% for kind of people who kind of assented to kind of the core evangelical doctrines. There were some people who kind of called themselves kind of born again Christians, but when you asked them what they actually believed, the numbers who believed in things like the deity of Christ or the inerrancy of the Bible or in a kind of personal faith or what the cross meant, of course, was much less. And even beyond that kind of 5% figure, some other kind of research that's been done, some of it a bit more ad hoc, I think kind of pushes the figure down to kind of like the kind of 1, 2, 3%. If you want to be very optimistic, you know, maybe 2 or 3%. But you know yourself, Peter, if you're standing in the centre of Glasgow, or if you're standing in the centre of Edinburgh on Princess Street... I don't know why you'd
want to stand in the centre of Edinburgh, but yeah, it makes sense.
But for scientific research purposes, obviously. But if you're standing in one of these kind of main thoroughfares in Scotland on a Saturday, the idea that more than 1 or 2 or 3 people in 100 that are passing you have a strong, robust evangelical faith. You know, I just don't think any of us really buy that or would believe that. So I think we're right down at that kind of very base level.
I remember when we were at Harper, Alan McKnight, they did some research, must have been maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, and just looking at Glasgow, the city council boundaries, and they had a broad kind of definition of like a broadly evangelical Christian or a broadly evangelical church. Now some of them, I remember a big one had like Creflo Dollar speak at it, so very broad, probably nothing where we would want to consider ourselves. But even then it was generously 1.5% to 2% of Glasgow would attend a broadly evangelical church. Which again is crazy because again Glasgow was very much a history of this kind of gospel ministry. The whole slogan, like "Let Glasgow flourish by the preaching of His word, the praising of His name." And again, I think it's really interesting case study Glasgow in the West, not just because that's kind of my role, but as Scotland as a whole has declined, you can see that very clearly in this kind of city like Glasgow. And a really other interesting thing about Glasgow is you see the split. I think because if you take off like kind of mainstream secular Scotland, I think the percentage of people identified as Christian will be a lot lower. When you come to the more deprived communities or the scheme communities, I do think you will have a lot more people identifying as Scotland. One of the reasons for that is because there's a big kind of Protestant Catholic divide still, and so historically, culturally, there still is. I'm a Rangers fan, I'm Protestant or Catholic. And yet again, on both sides of that, Protestant or Catholic, it would be a nominal understanding of the historic confession of what it is to be a Christian in the Bible. One of the things we're actually going to release hopefully the next week or two is a podcast with one of my mates who is diehard Protestant, but we want to talk about preaching the gospel to Protestants, because again, just being a Protestant doesn't mean no Jesus, but also one of my mates who grew up culturally a Catholic, and how we then take the same gospel to the Catholic community as well, because I do think that sometimes those figures can be masked, and even walking about the schemes, there's a lot of people would consider themselves Christian because of that kind of cultural identity, but it's really hard to get to the heart of that kind of what it truly means to believe the Bible and to know Christ in that way. So that's got a lot of statistic stuff. You spent a lot of time driving around Scotland. Is that kind of played out when you kind of drive about? So think of some of the communities you go to, like some of the evangelical, it's all evangelical churches you go to, like, are there still like a lot of vibrant evangelical churches in many of these communities? Could it be said that the liberal church has been shrinking, but the evangelical church has been growing? Or do you think there's still a bit to go to see a kind of revitalisation of the gospel in that kind of sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, there's huge gospel needs wherever you go. So even where you look at areas where there's some encouraging stuff going on and there's a good, healthy church, relative to the wider population, of course, it's still a pinprick. You know, a couple hundred people in a community of 10,000, you know, is still really sort of scratching the surface. So you're thankful for it. I just go back to the last point. You know, I think we want to be generous, you know, in terms of our kind of wider kind of constituency of brothers and sisters, you know, in the gospel. So in terms of talking about key gospel doctrines, you know, want to be generous in the types of churches that those are in, and reflected by that and the work that's going on there, not to be too kind of narrow and tribal. But yeah, I mean, definitely there's big need there. I think in terms of the question about the kind of collapse of some of the bigger denominations, but also how does that kind of play out with the kind of more evangelical churches? I mean, one of the interesting statistics which has been recorded by the kind of Brierley research when they did their kind of Scottish census in 2016 was that the proportion of Christians who would identify as evangelical has risen within the kind of overall total of Christians. So I think in the 90s, it was about 25% or something of Christians who identify as evangelical. By the time you get to 2016, it had risen to about 35%. Now, the overall kind of numbers of Christians has declined, but within those who still call themselves Christians, it seems that evangelical churches kind of held up better, or certainly more people see themselves in that kind of frame of reference. And the significance of that is that if somebody in Scotland does meet a Christian today, that Christian is that bit more likely to kind of know the gospel and believe the Bible and give an account of Jesus Christ, which we would believe is more faithful to his message. So again, one of the things you've seen with the evangelical church, and the evangelical church hasn't been immune from decline. I mean, clearly evangelical church has shrunk as well, and there's lots of reasons why a church might close, never mind kind of liberal theology, legalism, becoming culturally irrelevant, sin being tolerated, respectable sins being tolerated. There's lots of reasons why a church might decline or close, division, for example. But the one part of the Scottish Church which does seem to have shown a bit of resilience and even a little bit of growth has tended to be the evangelical part of the church, whereas the more liberal, kind of bigger denominations have just seemed to have gone through the floor.
Which again we're to expect that, aren't we? Because the gospel, like the church is meant to thrive on the margins of society. Whenever we get wrapped up as the kind of dominant mainstream culture kind of thing, I don't think that's not where the light shines brightest, right? We're meant to be on the margins. We're meant to kind of be that different community which points to the hope of Christ.
But to get to your point, so it's Pete, about where the needs are within sort of Scottish towns and cities and the rest of it. Definitely the case that, as I said before, often evangelical churches have held up in slightly better off, more middle class areas. Whereas there has been a big collapse, a big retreat in many ways from more deprived or traditionally working class areas. So if you look at a city like Glasgow, you can kind of correlate the chances of having an evangelical church in your area according to the kind of prosperity or how well off that area is. So the kind of more middle class or more prosperous an area is, it's probably statistically more likely to have an evangelical church in it.
So Harper research that they did found that, again, in the kind of west of the city, the kind of more culturally middle class, affluent, arty places, you could find in some of the kind of districts 4 evangelical churches for every 10,000 people. Now, if we get folk listening in other countries, particularly America, that's still minuscule, right? We want way more than 4 gospel churches for 10,000 people. But in the wards in the east of the city, that would be considered the most deprived wards, the ward that we were in before we launched, they found there was a third of a gospel church for every 10,000 people. And that was the place across the board, that in the kind of richer, more affluent, middle class areas, there was far more access to the gospel than in the more deprived areas. And even some of the churches that were in deprived areas, actually the people that went to those churches would kind of drive in from more kind of middle class, affluent areas and come in as well. And again, just anecdotally, like even today, I think in Scotland, the UK, it's far more likely someone's going to plant a church in a city centre or a student district or all that it is in these communities, even though they have less access to the gospel in our type of communities. It's still not somewhere where I think you would go. But I guess what I'm asking you is that just our party line? Right, because that's what all the Americans who we want to give us money want to hear, or do you think that is fair? Like, as you look at, even if you just focus right into the FIEC, where are the vibrant, growing churches, and is that are there places where there's actually still a lot of struggle and like small churches that are in danger of closing, and how can you kind of survey that for us?
Yeah, so it's a very mixed bag. But as you say, I mean, one of the things that's been encouraging is there has been a kind of pushback to obviously being aware and conscious and concerned about some of the more deprived areas and working class areas, not least because of the work of 20 Schemes and others, networks like yourself and other people who have really sort of called that out and waved the flag for those people, for those populations, for that area of mission. So that's been good, and obviously there has been a little bit of kind of work in that area.
Because actually, I was just reading this morning in the Least, the Last and the Lost book that FIEC, the biggest percentage of the place of churches now, if you strip out the kind of one massive church, is in deprived communities. I think we've got 6 or 7 scheme churches in the FIEC as well. So again, we don't want to be seen here as people that are coming from the outside saying FIEC are terrible. We're on this, and we're definitely seeing that trend. I think you're right because of that. So.
And I think that's the key thing. It's kind of relative, because even in areas where there's a better degree of kind of evangelical witness or a kind of good going church, it's still a pinprick largely. So some people have expressed the kind of frustration that often new church plants come into a city and they all head to the student area to set up a cappuccino bar, or the prosperous areas to get the kind of lower hanging fruit, as they might see it. And some of the more kind of deprived areas, the kind of big industrial areas, the East End of Glasgow, for example, is very neglected. And of course, that is a kind of frustration at one level that there's not more church planting going on in like the East End where we are now and other places. But you don't want to be too critical of people that are coming in.
Well, you don't want to be too critical, Andy.
Of those other places, because there's still relative need there. There's more than enough kind of work to be done. But there is an issue there that we do need to kind of reorientate and recalibrate a bit to say, well, actually, if there's areas where there's virtually nothing going on, or it's a kind of desert in many ways for the gospel, putting lots of resources and backing into kind of churches where there's already kind of gospel witness going on, maybe that's a bit of a luxury,
I also think it's a bit of a double whammy, right? Because in the more middle class community, you're far more mobile. So you could drive here, you're working here, you're going to the gym here, you're going to the pub. You're more likely in that sense, I think, to come across, even though there's a low percentage of Christians, you're more likely to come across a Christian. Whereas our community is far less mobile. A lot of people live their lives within the kind of defined boundary of the scheme. They might go to the shopping centre out there, but then they'll come back and my family's here, my kids go to school here, my full life's here. And so there's far less access, even if everything else is even. I think there'd be far less access for people who live in a scheme community to the gospel. Never mind the fact that we also are skewed the other way and where we're planted. So I definitely do feel that it's a massive problem. And we would totally agree that, as we just spoke a lot about, Scotland as a whole nation is in need. But I do think that the imperative for us is to go to the least reached people and try and plant churches there, plant the gospel there, and hope that actually that is going to spread and become a movement of the gospel that will affect everywhere else. Like one of the big things we often think about is that whole trickle-down effect. So that a lot of people, Tim Keller, in some ways, who in many ways, great guy, brother in Christ, but would talk about you go for the elites of society, and that's why people plant in like the business districts and the middle class people. And if you get the elites of society, then the gospel's going to trickle down, and then the kind of poorer, more deprived, the gospel will get there. I just think the problem is that's not happened, and also secondly, that's not that's not what the Bible pushes us to, doesn't it? Like Jesus went to the bottom of society, and we want to expect. I think in the book, Mez talks about it like salmoning up. Or that kind of salmon job, that actually we should expect the opposite, that as we go and focus on the people with the least access, and that when we have the greatest physical need, but actually also spiritual need, that we should expect that to spin up. Anyway, this is just on our hobby horse here. I don't know why I'm taking over the podcast.
No, it's really helpful, and you're right. I mean, I think in that these books like Unreached and The Least, the Last and the Lost and other work that's been done, I think makes that point very well. That we sometimes have a very kind of worldly, kind of almost slightly carnal view of kind of who are important, who we should try to reach, and how we do mission. That we're kind of maybe slightly starry-eyed about getting the celebrities or the kind of big hitters. And actually, well, where did Jesus go? And also historically, how has the church grown? In the early centuries, it grew among largely poorer sections of society and the outcasts and the slaves and the neglected, because they welcomed the message in the way that others didn't. And Jesus said that would exactly be the case.
Like one of my kind of passions as we work in the west of Scotland, though, is that what I don't want to see is a kind of us and them approach to this. Like we are here working in deprived communities, you're there doing this, and it's like kind of competition. Like I don't think we're brothers and sisters in Christ, we are one. And I want to try and foster that kind of, which what you're doing through all 20 schemes, but foster that kind of partnership so that some of these bigger churches that maybe have a more middle class demographic, so your Harpers, your Greenviews, people like that, would actually catch that vision and see them as a church that would then plant into some of the more deprived communities that don't have access to the gospel. And we want to resource that, we want to train the people who do that, but we want these churches not just to think, right, we'll go to 20 schemes and hope communities Barlanark, they can plant into there. But actually that if the need is right about them, that they as a church, you as a church, would catch that vision and do that. So do you think, like, what are some of the barriers maybe that stop that happening, like over the last 30, 40 years? Or why are the bigger city centre churches not trying to plant in these type of communities? Because I think some of the barriers might be legit in my head. So what?
It's a big challenge, isn't it? Because obviously every church tends to work to its capacity to some extent, and is always trying to sort of, do as much ministry as it can do. Most leaders are trying to do that, utilise the resources. So the danger is, of course, you can get a bit kind of consumed with all your in-house stuff in your own kind of patch, which is good why in the last few decades there has been a big emphasis in church planting and churches kind of looking out. But again, of course, then people tend to look at areas that are similar to their own, or where do their people live at the moment, and they'll tend to live often in similar areas. So if you're doing a church plant, it might be kind of replicating a similar kind of model in a similar kind of place. So I guess it's trying to cast that kind of vision. I guess the roots go quite deep. There can be a bit of a middle-class prosperity gospel. As conservative evangelicals, we will often rail against a prosperity gospel, but we'll have our own kind of subtle version of it in terms of kind of our own kind of aspirations about career and where we live and the schools that we go to and that kind of stuff. And we can dress that up as kind of stewardship and responsibility and hard work. And there's truth in all that, but of course it can also be a smokescreen for just not wanting to push ourselves out of comfort zones or go to other places.
Like that's certainly been the whole like kind of social lift, or like even again some of the churches in more middle class demographics definitely have believers from working class backgrounds, but it does tend to happen. Someone would hear the gospel, get saved, and then move up and move out, and would kind of get more. And I think in the past that's almost been seen as that's the automatic effect of the gospel, that as you get saved, you then move up in society, which again is horrendously wrong. But I do think that across the board has been the case in many ways as well. And it's funny, I found, so our family moving into a housing scheme from like, I don't know, middle class lad, and I find people have found that in many ways weird and why on earth are you doing that? But if you were to go to Brazil or go to Africa, it's like, oh great, like you're a missionary for the Lord, and we want to take the gospel to these communities, but there is that weird kind of dynamic where we're not going to go here to these places here, and we'll get onto this now, but we've far more people from America coming to minister in our communities than we do from middle class communities down the road. Like I haven't pretty much no one from a middle class community in Scotland move into our community, whereas I've had numerous people over the years move from across the world, and that's not for lack of trying. Like I remember at Harper, that was one of the things we wanted to do strongly, like please come catch this vision and move in. And it wasn't that people didn't see the need, it wasn't that they weren't kind, want to do something about it, but I do think there is something in that kind of psyche that it's uncomfortable, and that's for somebody else, that's not for me.
I think that there's definitely a kind of psychological kind of reorientation we need, and I guess because we've had such a strong and historic kind of Christian kind of culture and legacy, where we've been the people that have sent out missionaries to other parts of the world. So even in my kind of lifetime, if you had thought, going back a bit beyond my lifetime, but you go back to
1700s,
the 50s or something like that, and you had named anywhere in the UK, you probably could have been reasonably confident there'd be some kind of church there, and probably some kind of evangelical witness, some kind of work going on in that community, that town, that area. You could have taken that for granted a bit. Wouldn't have been entirely true, but largely you'd have gone to some town in Scotland and there'd be something going on, for Christ. Now, of course, that's not the case. There's huge population areas, there's whole towns, whole communities where there's really nothing going on. Sometimes there's not even a church of any description, never mind one that's going to share the gospel clearly with people. So we have to move away from the mindset where we're still thinking of mission and being missionaries as basically going abroad, and actually realising we need a much more kind of missionary mindset in our own kind of country. Actually moving from one side of the city to another, is actually what's required now.
And honestly, see if 5% of members of some of the churches that are more middle class Catholic communities moved into a housing scheme, it would revolutionise the ministry that we could do in these communities. That, like, most of the time, what we need more than interns and gospel workers is just healthy members that'll come and live their lives alongside these people and point them to Jesus. And like, honestly, that if people are listening to this and are wondering, the conversation I had last week, why are Americans coming? Why is it all about these Americans coming? And I'm like, I would love people in Scotland to catch that vision and move in. And again, it's not saying that the places where they are now have no need. Like every community in Scotland has needs, right? We need churches in all these communities. But I do think statistically and just experientially that the most deprived communities have far less access, and therefore the influence a family or two could have would be massive.
There's definitely a kind of mindset shift is needed there, isn't there? And I guess maybe for people who come from the States, because it is more like kind of foreign mission at one level, then that psychological barrier is not such a big thing to cross. There's lots of other barriers to cross, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm in awe of people that would move across the Atlantic and come to Scotland, and so thankful for them. But one of the issues, of course, is that we still have a mindset in our churches where if somebody says, I'm going to become a missionary and go to Africa or Asia, often we can generate quite good support for them, you know. Whereas if somebody says, well, I want to go to a small struggling church somewhere else, the mentality to raise support and to get behind them isn't there. And one of the issues is, in terms of raising up people, kind of Indigenous Scots, to go to some of the churches and the places you're talking about, or even just kind of struggling churches and kind of Scottish towns and various places, is the kind of resources, is funding. I was speaking to an American guy yesterday working in the UK, and you know, they've been kind of bringing across sort of workers and families to sort of work in UK churches and do church planting, and great stuff that's going on there. And of course, he's asking me about opportunities in Scotland, and I'm sort of trying to sort of talk about various kind of situations where there are churches who would love to have a pastor or a worker who see the need to be revitalised, who want to grow again, who recognise they need some fresh leadership, but they just don't have the funds to do that. So increasingly, almost having to kind of look to people to come from the States to fill those gaps, which is brilliant, but because they've got the funding. Whereas guys in Scotland who probably could do some of those jobs, not enough of them, but could do those jobs, but I don't know where the funding's going to come from for that to happen.
And that's where, like, we are so thankful and blessed to have the support of brothers and sisters around the world, and through 20 schemes particularly, that are catching that vision and are able to, are willing and able to fund it, because they see, and it's obviously easier to see from a distance, but they see the real missionary need for this context in our communities. And so I would always be saying to people, like, don't let money be an excuse. Like, the Lord is not skint, right? With the money, we will, and I know it's easy to say that, right? And I'm not saying that it's easy, there's loads of options, but what I'm saying is, if you feel the Lord is giving you this passion to come, then come and talk to us. And there'll be people that we know that might help fund this, and we can do that, or there's other ways we can think you through it. I guess where I was also trying to get to was, so your Greenviews, your Harpers, churches in more middle class communities, and then also this plays out at the individual level, can often think we could never do that. Like, and we've had conversations before, like church planting sometimes gets billed as like, you need this like Superman character that's going to come in and plant a church and be this big kind of personality. And I said to you, if that's the case, that would never be us. I think to plant a church, what you need is willingness and trust that will show in his endurance, right? So it's hard, church planting, but it's not hard because you need to be so gifted and talented. I think it's hard because you're going to get battered and you're going to need to look to Jesus and endure. And so my, I guess, hope over the next number of years as we focus in the west of Scotland is that other of these good gospel churches that I love, like your Greenviews, Harpers, again, there's two that are closest to us, would see actually if the need's there on our doorstep and we're willing to go and do that, then the Lord will provide the rest, isn't it? And as 20 schemes in the West, I want to be resourcing people, I want to be training people, I want to be finding money, I want to be giving, like, helping build teams and help with all the contextual stuff, because it is hard, right? And we are moving cultures from a middle class culture to a working class culture, but that happens all around the world. And I think if you're willing to do it, and if you see the need and say, do you know what, this is going to be hard, but instead of planting a church that looks like me in a place that looks like ours, the need's here. And I wonder if the Lord would use us to do that. I think that they would. I think the Lord would, and that's why I want to see a lot of that kind of growth in the west of Scotland.
No, I think that's a vision they just need to share more and more across churches, to encourage people to think about that, to pray about that, to see that need for larger churches to do it. I mean, huge number of FIEC churches are small churches, so they're kind of, you know, living on a shoestring as it is and just trying to get by and seeing their own need for revitalisation. But that kind of bigger vision does need to be kind of cast, because many of those churches would be in those areas, as you've mentioned, and would have those kind of needs. And for the bigger churches as well, who often are investing and supporting stuff, so want to acknowledge that and, be thankful for that. And, we're all kind of quite strapped, across the board. But definitely that kind of vision is something you need to get out there, that kind of trying to change that mindset about mission and what mission is and what that looks like in our UK context today, that it's not something which is just kind of overseas or far away. And also just encouraging people to be sacrificial in their kind of giving and to invest in the kingdom of God in the long term. And it's also being patient, isn't it? Because that's one thing about church planting, is that often people are looking for a bit of a kind of, big bang for their buck, and lots of results and, for a big return. But actually, gospel work is historically kind of slow and small and incremental. So one of the books that I've enjoyed reading in recent years is Rodney Stark's The Triumph of Christianity, and he talks about the growth of Christianity really throughout its history. Lots of interesting observations he makes. But he talks about in the first kind of couple of centuries of Christianity, really kind of post-Pentecost, maybe up until about the time of Constantine, where Christianity became then the kind of official religion. He estimates that the church probably grew at a rate of about 3.4% a year during that period. Now that gets you over a couple of hundred years. That's a lot, because compound interest, has its effect. It stacks up. So by the time you get to
a good financial illustration there,
by
Andy.
the time you get to Constantine, you're kind of at a tipping point almost in terms of the society being pretty much Christian in terms of majority of people's affiliation. But the point about that is, if you were in Athens Evangelical Church in 150 AD.
I like to call it Hope Community Church Athens. But
that's the one, yes. I'm forgetting that, yeah. So if you're in that church, Evangelical Church in Athens in 150 AD, and you had 100 members, by the end of that year, you might expect to have 103, or maybe 104 in a good year. And of course, the growth wasn't kind of uniform over that 200 years. Sometimes it might have gone back. Sometimes it might have been in the very low kind of percentage points. There have been phases where there had been a great kind of influx of people, and the church might have kind of really kind of flourished. And I think we're in one of those times where 3.4%, would be a great return, for our efforts and our labours. I think many of us aren't even seeing that. But it's a slow process.
And that's why it's about endurance.
And not to be naive about church history, that, that in all of church history, there was this kind of amazing kind of explosive growth everywhere. There were points like that, but actually for much of it, it was just Christians getting on with witnessing and living well among their neighbours and being lights for Christ. And seeing very modest kind of growth overall. And
again, and that's why I want to, in some ways, like demystify what we're trying to do as 20 schemes, because it is really just living in a community surrounded by people who need Jesus, living with Jesus, sharing the gospel. Right? And again, we need to think carefully about some of the cultural differences and how the gospel can pierce there. But in reality, what we're trying to do in the richest community in Scotland is what we're trying to do in the poorest community in Scotland, which is live for Jesus, share Jesus, and just pray that His Spirit moves and bring people to Him. And I guess the concern is we're not doing that percentage-wise in some of these communities, and we want to do that more. And I think everybody does want to do that more. And I think it's just about thinking through, well, how then together can we do this? So I guess the two big takeaways, honestly, like, is one for churches, like if there's church leaders that are thinking about this stuff and want to think it through more, I'd love to get a copy of that book, at least the last of the lost, to them. Particularly in the West of Scotland, I'd love just to chat to us a bit more about how can all of us together who come for the same convictions think about doing this and kind of demystify that. I'd love to get people talking, but I think even more so, I think what we need to see, or would love to see, is not just more from America coming. We need that, right? Again, I always say in the West of Scotland, certainly, that the need is as great as the amount of people that we can get. So we've got 3 church planters we're training just now. We're going to send them out to 3 communities. If we had 5, we could send them out to 5 communities. So the need is as great as the amount of people we can get. We need more from America and from all around the world. but I would love to see more from Scotland. I'd love to see more from Britain. People that maybe were the place that I was and thought, I could never plant a church. Like, I'm not a massive, big bodybuilder, like big personality guy. If you love Jesus, if you love people and you love the church, then we'd love to talk to people like that. And I reckon there must be people in churches in Scotland that see that need and that maybe just want to move in and be part of helping as members of these churches, but maybe also the Lord is calling to plant or to be in full-time ministry in these communities. And as 20 Schemes, we'd love to train people alongside that. We'd love to do that in the local church alongside kind of different organisations as well. But if you know if people are listening that fall into that bracket and the Lord you feel is calling you, we'd love to talk about that too. And really get at this together, because this is the mission of the church, right? We want to see this happen.
No, we do. We need it all, don't we? We need people to come because the need is huge, and we need to see people being raised up from among us. Both those things need to happen. They're not either ors. They're definitely both ands, because we're in such a situation in Scotland now in terms of gospel need, that we need all the help we can get. We need all the good gospel men and women that want to come. But we also do need to have that kind of vision to raise up people from our own churches and to cast that vision and to think about how we support them and to see that happening. And the other element of this, I guess, which is worth mentioning, is immigration. Actually, the growth of churches that have been started by people who've been coming to the UK in recent years, ethnic minority background churches. I was at a seminar during lockdown with a Ghanaian academic who'd been doing some research in Glasgow, and she reckoned that there was over 100 churches that she had recorded that had started in Glasgow since 2000. She thinks they were largely unrecorded by the kind of Brierley census in 2016, the majority of which are from an BAME kind of background, whether sort of Nigerian or Asian kind of background churches, often under the radar because they're meeting in living rooms and up sort of stairs and things like that, out the way shop fronts. But God is working there. These seeds are being sown, these little communities. What's really encouraging is that many of our brothers and sisters in those churches do have a real heart to reach their white British kind of neighbours. And so there's lots of things going on, and that could be the seed of kind of great gospel growth in years to come. But equally, we need to be partnering there, but we need to be doing it ourselves.
Because what we want to see is churches or people from every background in the communities where we are. Again, that's what we always say. We're not trying to plant 20 working class churches. We're trying to plant 20 churches, working class areas. And many of our churches, in fact, I would say most of our churches now in 20 Schemes have got Black and African minority communities in them as members. And we see that more and more in the Scheme communities. And again, we would love to see, that's Ephesians. We're one in Christ. We want to be united together and take the gospel to those around us. Anyway, Andy, thank you so much. That's been helpful. You brought the stats, you brought the chat. I'm really thankful. I've just tried to muddle along here, which is really good. But thankful for you.
Well, no, the Lord bless what you're doing, Pete, and the work here and that wider vision for Scotland. And we just need to keep sharing it. And
there's a house down the road for sale. Are we going to go see that just now as well for you?
Yeah, well, you put me on the spot now, haven't you? So well, that's the thing. It's a challenge for every one of us. So. Cool.
Right, guys, thanks for listening. Any questions, comments, please get in touch. We're going to put a couple of links in the comments as well. There's one to that blog we wrote about we need people from Scotland and Britain to come, so please be reading that too. But thank you for you, Andy. We'll see you next time for the next Greenview Elder on 20 Schemes.